My name is Aviva Kapust. I am the executive director of an organization in Philadelphia called the Village of Arts and Humanities. Just so I get a sense, how many people have actually been to the village in their lifetime? Anybody? Okay. So I'm really excited to be here with a panel of all local artists and change makers. We have only an hour, so we're going to cram in a lot and try to get a good amount of time for us to have a conversation with you guys. So I'm going to talk for about 10, 12 minutes, and then these guys are going to go through some introductory presentations. So I won't introduce them now, I'll let them introduce themselves. But I also wanted to kind of get something out of the way in the beginning, and that is the term placemaking. So we're here to talk about people and place and art, and over time, as especially the creative placemaking field has become very popular and somewhat well-funded, or better funded than it used to be, the terminology and also I think the practice itself has become a little problematic, and people move in the direction of renaming. So some people say, placekeeping, peacekeeping, peacemaking, there's creative placemaking, and then there's placemaking. And I want to just move away from thinking too much about the language today, although I do believe that language is incredibly important. What we say matters. And really think about this in terms of equity. So how are we using arts and culture to build places with people that are fair and inclusive, and creating upward mobility for all people. And that is not to say that we can't talk about the validity of some of the practices and some of the projects that are sort of couched underneath placemaking, but I want us to have a little faith that we all are on the same page about equitable creative placemaking during this presentation. So, the Village of Arts and Humanities, the reason this slide says through the arts is that we are a 30-year organization in one of the most disinvested neighborhoods in Philadelphia, which is saying a lot, Philadelphia being one of the poorest cities in the nation. And we use arts and culture to drive individual and community-wide self-actualization. So for us, art is a tool. And we know from many years, and from our founder, Lily Yeh, who is a great friend of the village still and a mentor of mine, that artists can create the foundation for profound social change. When we're talking about artists, we're not talking just about the makers of things, the painters and the creators. We're talking about creative thinkers, people who are reimagining problems and reimagining responses and solutions to some of the most challenging issues of our time. We're talking about facilitation and co-creation being in these settings even greater than making and interpreting. Working with people to discover and then to act upon our discoveries, and working alongside them using your tools as a creator to build something new that people may not have seen as possible before. At the Village, we know this from a very, very long history of these creative thinkers. So our history goes back 30 years, but it even goes back before that to a man named Arthur Hall, who was brought into this neighborhood in North Philadelphia because there were huge riots going on Girard Avenue. So extreme civic unrest. He was a choreographer, a dancer, civil rights activist, and the mayor at the time said, we need to do something about the black people who are burning down our city. And they bring in this very, very well-known black artist and say, we're going to give you money from the Model Cities program, and you're going to give them something to do. So that's the kind of thinking that was going on at the time, and the pushing the problem away. We don't want this problem. But at the same time, here was the first time in that neighborhood that an artist was coming into the community development work. This wasn't, hey, can you do some performances and some dance and this and that? They didn't care. They said, work on society's issues. Unfortunately, they said, do it, without us, which is the history of the village. So when no one was looking, a kind of miracle happened in this tiny disinvested neighborhood that has lasted this long. So Arthur made a promise to the people that he brought together through celebrating their culture and their heritage through art. He promised them that if they worked together, gang members off the streets now wearing tights, that their voices would travel across the city, across the nation, and across the world, and that was what happened. So for us, what we take from Arthur is a legacy of making promises through art and acting on them immediately. Art's a powerful tool in doing that, especially in a community where promises are broken all the time. So these people, this group, was in Ghana talking to them about their tiny little place in the world in Philadelphia. Pretty amazing, really powerful. Years later, he met Lily Ye, who was on a tenure track as a painter and a teacher at University of the Arts. They shared a belief that the aesthetic beauty around us, man-made or natural, is a human right. Neither of them took no for an answer, and he said, why don't you come to the neighborhood? Maybe you can do something with the brokenness in the outside environment that I'm doing with the brokenness inside all of us. And so Lily came knowing not how to build a park, not knowing how to create a mosaic, never painting a mural that big in her life. And that became this. And now this. So we're talking, and I could do like an hour on how that actually did happen, because it's pretty crazy. But a small 3 square block campus, intermingled with residents. My neighbors to my office are people who are the sons and daughters of a man named Big Man who taught Lily how to be safe in the community, how to keep people safe, and how to keep herself safe, People like JoJo Williams, who was a carpenter and a mason worker, taught her how to build parks. She didn't know how to do that. From Lily, we learned that lifting up the assets in the community in order to build something that creates the future that people want to see for themselves, that's how you make change. She didn't come in and say, I have a vision for how to do this. Really, really important. And over time, as the fabric continued to break, beauty came up around everybody. And to this day, that space, it's an informal safe zone. Nobody owns it. There's no signs up that say, no violence, no crime here, put it over there, that block, just 1 block over. This is a sacred space to the community, It's next to one of the last high-rises in the neighborhood. All of those kids, this is where they come for peace. So we have now 15 art parks and gardens, 10 buildings and 8 programs, all intentionally combining art, education, and community development. The way that we work is reflective of this history of artists embedding themselves in communities over long periods of time to feel, see, and hear what's needed and wanted, not make assumptions. Again, we always start with a question or a challenge. We always bring art in to creatively research. It's really important in these areas, whether you're rural or urban, if you've been researched on consistently, data's been collected, you've been studied, how do you bring art in a way to do that that is humane, respectful, interesting, rooted in discovery without, I want to prove this thing that I suspect might be true? And we ideate, we prototype, we evaluate, we iterate. We continue that as a spiral that goes usually way deeper into some of these really difficult problems. We formalized this in honor of Lily and Arthur into a program called Spaces Artist in Residence Program. We bring visiting artists. They can be local or they can be from another city like Richmond, Virginia, these artists that I'll talk about. We bring them together. Everybody is paid equally. Artists in the community, we call them neighborhood artists, who are not necessarily artists in the way you may think. They're people living in the community that want to be engaged civically and creatively. And we bring them together with these visiting artists. They work together for 4, 6, 9 months, investigating a question that has emerged from the community itself. For example, how can we transform the narrative of reentry? In Philadelphia, 2 in 5 residents has a criminal record. In our neighborhood, it's 3 in 5. Every single young person out of 400 young people in our youth program have either a neighbor or a family member who's been incarcerated or is incarcerated. So this is a really big problem and nobody solved it. So how do we bring the people who have experienced it, the experts, together with people who can help them, free them up of the daily, rigmarole, the daily hustle, and get them to be able to think creatively about the problem and act. So People's Paper Co-op was designed. It is a business that sells books and handmade books and paper, but it emerged from a project that looked at how we can take the social service environment and bring culture and creativity into it. So we have expungement clinics in Philadelphia where you can expunge a criminal record. When you come into one of our expungement clinics, you're surrounded by artwork, you're welcomed by a person who has been impacted by the criminal justice system, and you can print out your criminal record after you've spoken to a lawyer for free, which usually costs hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars. And you can print out a copy of your record, you can pulp it in a blender, you can create a new sheet of paper, you can take a photo of yourself embedded in the piece of paper and create a reverse mugshot, all in one sitting or one visit. But what's really cool is that this becomes an organizing and an advocacy project too. A sterile social service environment provides an opportunity for people who think that they're alone in their reentry to recognize that their voice alongside hundreds and hundreds of these reverse mugshots is super powerful. They can vote out back judges. They can change the way that they are treated as human beings. They also run an internship program, they have a storefront, lots and lots of services. I want these guys to be able to speak, so I'm going to leave you with a recent project that was just funded through Art Place. We did a lot of research into where the places and people of power in the neighborhood are, and how do we network them, and how do we build the civic power in the neighborhood in order to drive change. Not just a seat at the table for us as artists or community members, but how can they drive it, right? And if our neighborhood is one of sort of the last frontier, not gentrified neighborhoods, how do we get ahead of, of the problems, or the designs made on a community that set the stage for displacement and gentrification? We do that by fueling civic power. Teaching, learning, and practicing civic power. So we're creating an actual facility and a program that builds the civic power of our neighborhood called the Civic Practice Studio. And as we build it, I would love for anybody and everybody who has ideas or questions or thoughts to participate. But again, a discovery that came out of these partnerships between artists and neighborhood residents that traditional community development solutions are not uncovering or answering. Discovery is so important, and I hope that today we can talk a little bit about that as well. It is not a traditional stream of funding in the arts world or even the community development world to ask for money for discovery. How do we learn and respond quickly to what we know is needed? And so that's kind of where the village is today, and if you look back in history, it's really what we learned from decades and decades of really powerful, creative thinkers and activists before us. So I'm going to let these guys present some of their amazing work as well. Keep any questions you have, and we're going to get right into them afterwards. All right? Ready?
Okay, hey. All right. I have a presentation about the work of the Powell Arts Center, which is an arts and cultural center that we opened in Boston's Chinatown last year. I'm going to not do it because I just was really, what Aviva was talking about really appealed to me, so I would like to kind of tell you the story a little bit about Chinatown, a little bit about my organization and how that all came to be. I'm going to try to do it quickly so we can get to the larger conversation. So forgive me if I stumble on some of these things. So my name is Giles. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, BCNC. We are first and foremost I didn't mean for that. We're first and foremost a family-centered social services organization. So we were started in 1969 by a small group of parents at the local elementary school who really took inspiration from the community schools movement that was coming, I don't know, I guess this thing is the thing, that was coming out of New York, in which inner city schools, families that were at that school really wanted to use those schools as not just schools, but as community centers. And so BCNC came out of that, where families organized to create after-school programming and eventually early, preschool and adult programs and so on. Now, close to 50 years later, we're a larger organization, we're a different organization, but that kind of connection to the grassroots is still in our DNA, and you can still see it in the organization that we are. So last year we opened the Powell Arts Center, and I guess the reason why it's important for me to tell you the history of this is that this is kind of couched in this bigger story about Chinatown, not just Boston's Chinatown, but Chinatown across the country. So I'll tell you a little bit about Chinatown. Boston's Chinatown is really one of the last original Chinatowns that is still kind of vibrant and robust. By original Chinatowns, I mean Chinatowns popped up in many cities around the country. This was cities that were all connected to by Chinese labor that came in through California and eventually rode the Transcontinental Railroad, which they helped build across the country and kind of spread out everywhere. The Chinatown in Boston was kind of the last stop on that train ride, and they just felt, the story is that people continued to not get off in certain cities because they thought those cities were too racist, and they thought they might find a better place at the end of the train line, which was Boston. So we all know that's so they walked a few blocks and pitched tents on an alley that has now been renamed in their honor, and eventually that grew into the Chinatown that it is. And where they started, where they pitched tents, those original kind of Chinatown residents, that is still part of the Chinatown neighborhood. In other cities like New York, you have a big Chinatown in Manhattan, which allowed for the Chinese immigrant population, the low-income Chinese immigrant population that was in the city, to feel like they had a home base where they could kind of go out and explore further and further. And so now you have a larger Chinatown in Queens, Flushing, Queens, than you do in Manhattan. You have a larger Chinatown in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, than you do in Manhattan. So in most cities, the larger Chinatowns are actually no longer in the downtown area of the city. Los Angeles is the same, San Francisco has 4 Chinatowns, Chicago already. So in Boston, we do have other neighborhoods or other parts of the region that have large Chinese populations. Quincy is a place that comes to mind. But there's something about Boston's Chinatown that to me is very special. So, for my family, I think we have looked to Chinatown as a place where we got services, where my mother worked, where I got my first job. And this was something that connected us to a larger community of Chinese immigrants when we didn't necessarily have that in the neighborhood where we lived. And so it really gave us kind of the power to be able to build on something and feel like we belong. And so the story of the Powell Arts Center is really one that is couched in the story of gentrification of Boston and cities kind of nationwide. The Chinese population in Boston's Chinatown is no longer a majority of that neighborhood. It's less than 50% of Chinatown is Asian residents. The share of white residents of Chinatown has grown over the last 15, however many years. From the 2000 to the 2010 census, it went from about 40% to now over 60% of the population. That in itself is part of a much larger macroeconomic story, but how that impacts Chinatown is that people that would traditionally live there, low-income recent immigrants, no longer can afford to live there. And so what happens when you get further and further out from the place where you feel at home is that you feel disconnected and that you have less access to services. And it makes it more and more of a production to try to get into the places where there are things that speak to you, your family, and your culture. So we created the Arts Center because we didn't want people to only come to Chinatown to seek help or to do transactional business, like to eat, to shop, to get medical services, to get social services and counseling. We also wanted it to be a place where they had celebration and a feeling of home. And that we felt, by using arts as a way to kind of heal, there would be an opportunity to give people that kind of community where they couldn't find it where they live. I have a whole other thing to tell you, but I'll see if I have an opportunity to tell you during the Q&A, or if you're really interested in the specific history from 50 years ago, you can come talk to me afterward. But I will pass this on to Greg and allow us to get into the bigger conversation. Thank you.
While I'm doing this, my name is Gregory Jenkins, and I'm actually with the Somerville Arts Council, right next to Boston. And I think in terms of, I think Mary invited us all up, and sometimes when you do these sort of sessions or panels, you sort of say, oh, I've got this is the topic, here's who's coming, and then you say, well, what are we really going to be doing? And I know that I talked to, we had our own little conference call, but at the same time too, this issue of place is such a huge or broad, incredibly broad topic. And I think the one reason why Mary sort of has brought me in was in the sense of our little small cultural council, which has a staff of 4, in relationship to the sort of the larger work within the community, is some of the reasons why. So some of the slides, if I can find them, maybe not. Anyway, one of the things that I was going to talk about in terms of like a sense of place is sort of looking at issues of culture with the big C, assets, change, and sort of physical space in relationship to sort of those 4 main components and kind of the work that we do. But I do feel like those 4 overall aspects are like a lot of what we do as a local cultural council. So even with sort of the C in terms of larger cultural communities that we end up having, we do a lot of work within the Somerville's incredible sort of ethnic and diverse neighborhood. And I think setting up sort of mechanisms by where we're constantly trying to see who's coming into town, where is the energy in relationship to what people are doing, how do we sort of engage them? And well, again, we have a staff of 4. So we've done a lot of things where we have calls, we do a producers model, sort of everything we're doing is trying to set up this way in which we're engaging in the community. So we create these forms by which, in a way, we're trying to bring in and/or engage within the community. And that sort of larger C in terms of culture is really, really important in relationship to the sense of space. The physical space, and I don't see that, some of the slides that I had were, we've done a lot of work in Union Square, and what was interesting for me to submit these slides is sort of seeing how this one physical area is constantly getting sort of transformed by the way in which we kind of engage with people, whether or not it's in the Nepali community, whether it's with a gay, lesbian, trans community. So doing events, going to them, talking to them about what do they want to do, how do they want to present and physically promote themselves in relationship to the community, I think is really key, just on a level of both engaging them, but kind of like a praxis of sort of constantly sort of checking in on that. The one thing that I know that we always do too is that, the city is changing. I mean, it's always been sort of an immigrant working class community. It's gone from sort of Irish, Italian, to a certain extent Portuguese in relationship to the Azorean, to, there's a huge Haitian community. There's a burgeoning Nepali community. There's a large Salvadorian community. So the other thing that's happening now, obviously just in the 4 or 5 years, is that Somerville's become this amazing, diverse and looking at issues of assets. Everybody wants to be there. I mean, I think they want to be there because proximity to Boston, but I think they also want to be there because of this type of diversity. So then the question is about place, is all about sort of what are the existing assets and how do you cultivate and try to keep those assets, or at least to highlight the agency and voice of those people. And that now has become even more and more of our work, is to sort of say, what are the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure can we do to help sustain where there's even a physical place for people to basically engage or to feel comfortable. So a lot of our work in the past 3 to 4 years, in a way, is kind of shifted to that. So we did get an Art Place America grant. I think we were in Philadelphia at the same time, the Village, looking at Art Farm, and again, looking at assets within the community, the urban ag community, the artist community. There's a lot of energy. And so we're kind of cultivating that too. So our presentations are really quick and short, but those are kind of, again, the 4 aspects of assets, physical space, and then there's also a write-up that I had done that you guys should look at. Again, I have more of an anthropology and folklore background, so it's in the back too. So, thank you. Maybe you'll find this.
What I'm going to say, but good afternoon, everyone. My name is Celina Miranda, and I'm the Executive Director of Hyde Square Task Force. I'm going to stand here on the side because I'm trying to be technology savvy today. Not usually the way I operate, but my husband insisted. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am the Executive Director of Hyde Square Task Force, which is a youth development organization. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about our efforts to designate or to create or to name or recognize our neighborhood as Boston's Latin Quarter. So Hyde Square Task Force was created or was founded over 25 years ago. It came out of, in reaction to what was going on in the community at that time. So the community was rampant with violence, drug trafficking, and in fact it was known as the New England's cocaine capital. So there was a lot of drug activity happening at that time, and also violence and gang activity. So out of that, a group of neighbors came together, hence our name at Task Force, that came together in response to that. And from the very beginning, young people became central to our work. So youth have been at the core of everything that we do. And part of the work, in addition to service delivery to youth, we've always been very focused on advocacy and organizing. So that has been at the core of the work that we do. And over time, we have fought against big box retail stores. At one point, Kmart wanted to come in, and our young people were central and focused and advocated and organized against that, and Kmart did not happen. And then we've also pushed for affordable and equitable development in our neighborhood all throughout these years. Now, this has resulted in a thriving and more stable community, but what has happened is we've seen sort of the effects of that, right? Which has been gentrification. So where are we in the map when I talk about the Latin Quarter? We are located in the Jamaica Plain neighborhood of Boston, and it is an area with a deep history of Latino immigration. At one point in the 50s, it was primarily Cuban, then also Puerto Rican. Then during the Civil War in El Salvador, in the 70s and 80s, we saw an influx of Central American immigrants as well. And then most recently, the most recent wave of immigrants are actually Dominican. And what remains in the area is a strong flavor of Latino Caribbean culture. So Afro-Latin culture is big, and you can see it when you walk up and down the neighborhood. And our neighborhood right now, or at least our shopping district, 65% of 125 businesses are immigrant owned. And 40% of the population is Spanish speaking. But very similar to what Giles just shared is that in our neighborhood, we've seen a lot of changes happening recently. So you have luxury condos that are coming up and being there. And so in that context, we've been activating. And what we did most recently is that our young people worked with the City of Boston City Councilors to name that particular area of the neighborhood Boston's Latin Quarter. And we're currently working, so that happened in 2016. So now it is known by the City of Boston as the Latin Quarter. And now we're working with the City of Boston to get it recognized as one of the cultural districts in the Commonwealth. So that is our most recent work. But we're experimenting with what does it mean to do placekeeping, right? How do we maintain the history of the neighborhood, what it has been, and making sure that the residents that remain, because there is still a presence of Dominican and Cuban and Puerto Rican residents, how do we make sure that it's still a place where they belong, where they see themselves reflected in what's going on in the neighborhood? So those are the efforts that we're working on right now, and we'll get into the details, obviously, during the conversation.
So I'm Jen Audley, and I'm here representing the town of Montague. Everybody else on the panel is from closer to Boston, so I want to try to give you an image of where Montague is so that you can kind of understand what's different about the place that I'm talking about. So if you are in Boston, if you go on Route 2 west 100 miles, to the place where the Connecticut River bisects the state of Massachusetts, which is about 2/3 of the way across. Montague is there. If you take Route 91, which goes along the same route as the Connecticut River, we are the second to last exit before you get to Vermont. So we are an hour east of Massamoka, which is the other big landmark that people know in western Massachusetts. And we are a small town. We have 8,500 people. And that means that we also are in the smallest category of funding for local cultural councils. So I'm here because I'm the chair of the local cultural council in Montague. And another thing that sets me apart from my other panelists is that I think I am the only person on this panel who doesn't get paid for my work. So one of the things I'm wondering is, who's in the room with us here today? How many of you are from cities? And how many of you are from rural places? And how many of you are from places that are kind of neither or in between those two things? Okay, great. All right, so I've got these two pictures because the other thing I need you to understand about my place is that Montague is a town of 8,500 people. It has 5 villages. So it has 5 unique kind of places where people live. I live in Turner's Falls, which is the one that's at the very northern tip, where that dramatic bend in the river is. It is a place that has been inhabited by people for thousands of years. It has been inhabited by descendants of Europeans for a few hundred years. It has been a town called Turner's Falls since 1868, when it was built to be an industrial town. Somebody built a dam, there was hydroelectric power, and so one of the things that's interesting about Montague is that, and Turner's Falls particularly, is that everybody's talking about kind of what are your assets. One of our assets is that even though we're not a city, we have a built environment that's city-like. So our downtown is like 6 blocks, but it has a main street, and it has mixed-use buildings. It has residences with storefronts below, and it's clearly bounded by places where people can work, places where people can worship, places where people can recreate. And so that's been the advantage for us. So the map that's on the right side is showing you Turner's Falls as it was envisioned in our downtown livability plan, which is a very community-engaged process of thinking about what kind of place do we want our downtown to be. And it also happens to be a picture of our new cultural district. So that's kind of cool because that map was made years before we had a cultural district. And I think that's all I'm going to say because I can probably tell more stories when you have your questions to answer.
That's great. I'm gonna actually, can you guys hear me in here? Yeah. I'd like to open it up for you guys to ask questions of any of us. So does anybody, if you don't, then, yeah, sure. If you could just speak up. You want to take this one? Sure.
Hello, thank you all for these presentations. Jennifer, I have a question for you. That map is actually fascinating. In my own town, I deal with a little bit of that kind of disparate places and fractured sense of community just from the waves of people and settlements. Is there a plan within Montague to try and unify those spaces, and how successful has that been, or what have been your challenges?
Let's see how this works. Oh, it's pretty good. So, which one is your town? Littleton. Okay, so she lives in Littleton. So, I think that the answer is that our next step is to try to expand our cultural community development efforts outside of Turner's Falls. But because more than half of the people who live in Montague live in Turner's Falls, that's really been the focus, and that's really the success story. And the strategy for expanding is to look at the one of the villages that is the most similar, because we kind of know what worked in Turner's Falls. So one of the other villages, Miller's Falls, has a similar kind of history. It has the same kind of built environment and the same kind of village feel.
Thank you. Yeah. That's great. Back there? Yeah.
Hi, yes. Only if you're recording, otherwise oh, you are, great. Hi, I run a community foundation down in New Bedford, and one of the things, and I think this is probably for Celina or Greg or whomever. So in New Bedford, we have a lot of new immigrant populations, and we have been trying to work with that community to figure out how to support them in their expression of art and culture in a community that doesn't have those organizations. Needless to say, to be an immigrant in this country these days is a very different situation than it was 18 months ago. So we have tried outreach, we've tried focus groups, and just getting folks to show up and actually engage with us in a conversation, when in fact for a lot of these people, just staying out of the radar is more important than an opportunity to do what we are hoping they would do. Any insight into how to think about that?
So for us, I know one of the things that has helped us a lot is the work that we've done with young people. Because it's through those connections and those conversations with them that they're able to then go back and help us sort of pull out and bring out the parents and be able to create also safe spaces. And so what some of the slides that you didn't see, it's sort of the outdoor concerts that we're doing, all the activities that we're doing outside to create a vibrant, safe space. And we've also been using theater and the arts to address some of those topics that have come up. We at Hyde Square Task Force, we have a troupe of theater, a theater troupe. And so our youth in the summer, last summer, actually focused their piece on immigration. And they hosted a dialogue with residents to be able to begin to name the fears that are going on privately in the homes, discussions that are happening every single night around the dinner table, that we were able to talk and then bring about those conversations. We've done several things to be able to create that space on an ongoing basis, but I do think that our young people have been key in making that happen.
And when you say young, are you high school?
These are high school students, yes.
Thank you.
I mean, for us, it sounds, it's somewhat obvious, but I know it's difficult, but I mean, what we did within our Union Square work is sort of intentionally saying that we would put a call out, but we knew we weren't reaching, a lot of the population because they weren't getting this call. So some of years ago, we intentionally sort of found say the Nepali community, one leader. It sounds terrible, and there's a lot of danger in working with one sort of ethnic leader or two ethnic leaders. But out of that, to sort of keep having meetings, and I know with one of the first sort of forays into either working within the Haitian community. We know people within the Haitian community, but I'd say the Nepali community was something that was a little harder to crack. The constant meetings, a lot of meetings. So weekly meetings to keep saying, what's going on in your community, how would you like to express yourself, and identify yourself to a larger community. What would you want to do? What types of cultural traditions would you like to express? What are some of the issues? So I think part of it is just, as an anthropologist or folklorist, is just field work, really getting in there and saying, who there somewhat represents your community. It's a terrible way of saying it, but to keep diving into that and then keep saying, and keep meeting people. That work takes a lot of effort. And then from that, basically giving them, quote, a stage. To a certain extent, providing them with money and providing them with an infrastructure to say, what do you want to do? And then you're there supporting their sort of expression. And I think on a simplest way, like doing something like that, and then not having a preconceived notion that if you did it again a year from now, it's going to be the same thing. It could be something totally different. Just allowing for that level of change, because people come and go. There's capacity issues, on down the list. So I think just that type of, quote, I would say what's called field work, do that.
Can I ask something? Just, so for us, the way that we've engaged people is, we're primarily a social services agency, and so people, even if they're not interested in arts or participating culturally in that way, they do go to get medical services, they get dental services, they get public benefits, they bring their children to school, etc. And so those are ways that we can engage people by facilitating an easier pathway from services that many immigrants use into something that they wouldn't be the highest priority for them. It it facilitates participation, but also it changes the paradigm a little bit in that people are not defined by their needs, defined by addressing what their biggest challenges are, but are also defined by their opportunities to participate, engage in the community, and build a community. And that also is kind of a form of empowerment.
I'll add one last thing, and then we'll move on to the next person. I would say meeting people where they are, just to summarize, what was said here, whether that's from like a geographical, like an actual place, and also where they are, what they're interested in and what they're sort of capable of at that moment, and compensate them for their time. We don't, it gets tricky to figure out, how much is your time worth. But we all in this room, when we just addressed that, how much is your time worth? Working to develop a small town using arts and culture. How much is your time worth sitting in this room? People are researched to death. They're engaged to death. It's respectful to compensate them. So that's another recommendation. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
It's great hearing from all of you. Giles, could you talk a little bit about working with, are there things your organization is doing to try to keep the population you're trying to serve in the neighborhood? And for those who've already moved out, what are your strategies on getting them to come back into the neighborhood? I know you're saying, arts activities are not just services, but do people feel like they want to build their communities where they're living and not come back into the central neighborhood?
Yeah, it's an excellent set of questions. I think to try to keep people in the neighborhood, that's the work of many of the different organizations that are located in the neighborhood, and we will collaborate. So we think that arts and culture plays a role in that, but it's also, that can't be done without tenant organizing. It can't be done with advocacy for development of more affordable housing in the neighborhood. And there's been a lot of physical development in Boston over the past many years, and it could be better, and I guess it could be worse. So, that's just a lot of people kind of coming together to try to push the range of solutions that help people continue to be able to afford to live in that neighborhood. And arts is a part of that, but it is not. It definitely would not be the thing that could do it alone. The other question about where people end up moving to and how can they build community in those places is also really excellent. I think that for, at least in the Chinese or in larger Asian immigrant communities, one of the things that has allowed for communities outside of kind of these central city areas to be strong and to thrive is actually the existence of a strong central neighborhood. I'll give you kind of like one example. I was talking about the original Chinatowns before. In the 1960s, the land where the Arts Center is, 200 families were displaced because of eminent domain. They built the highway ramp, if you know, off of 93 there. And one of the things that happened was there was a neighborhood called Syrian Town. I don't know if people know about that, but there was a Syrian Lebanese population that lived right there at the south end, which was decimated completely. All of those people ended up no longer being able to live there. And now you look at, there is really no Syrian community hub in Boston or in the Boston area. And I think part of that, you can trace that back to the fact that the hub that they had was destroyed. And so maybe they all could have moved to West Roxbury and created a hub there, but that's not really how kind of movement works, right? When the city or when kind of the powers that be make a decision to kind of build a throughway for cars rather than for people here, the people don't all en masse move somewhere else. And so the way that I think the migration of that kind of low-income Chinese immigrant population has worked in the Boston area is that they've spread out, and there's some kind of critical masses, here and there, but the way that those places become mini Chinatowns, or at least neighborhoods that are more supportive than they currently are, is when they have a larger, physical space in the city center that can serve as a support, a hub to the spokes of the wheel.
Anybody else? So I have a question actually for the panel here. We still have time?
Oh,
Yeah, okay. So, we talked about preserving community authenticity a little bit. We haven't touched too much on economic opportunity, but we can get there. Justice and social change. I think that one of the things that we're talking about a lot these days in terms of placemaking is arts and culture having a seat at the table. And one of the things that interests us, most at the Village and in Philadelphia is how arts and culture can actually drive the setting of the table, the conversation itself, make those conversations happen. So before the forces that drive, gentrification and displacement come to bear, how does arts and culture start to drive alternative conversation about our neighborhoods? And I'm wondering, your thoughts on that, experiences, stigma?
Talk a little bit. I mean, if anybody knows, Somerville, our mayor, I think because we were sort of seen as this kind of what they called Slummerville and working class city, he's had this amazing ability. He's he's great at being able to sort of bridge old and new. And I think he has an incredible capacity of identifying that and knowing that the city has to change. But then the question is, how do you change that sort of having, quote, your values of where you're coming from? It is interesting, some of the key words that he uses. And I feel like I've fed him certain things to keep talking about this issue of change relative to culture and values. And I think it's really, really important. So our mayor, in a lot of ways too, will talk about, we may not have the solution to all of our problems like gentrification or things like that, but we as a creative city, and he'll say this, as a creative city can find ways to address these issues. How do we as a creative community problem solve? So in a way, even a lot of that kind of language is embedded into that. The key issue that I think that we have is not enough about the language and sort of taking ownership or taking pride of, quote, your creative community, but like sort of financially, what money are you putting up? What assets are you really going to contribute to this? So there's this constant battle on my end or internally of, we can say all this, but then what does it mean on a physical standpoint? And I think that's a key issue, because you can have a community sort of say, I want you to be at the table, and you are at the table, but when you walk away, what did you get after you walked away from that table? And I hate to say it, it's not enough just to be at the table, because they're going to invite you to that table, because no one's going to say, no, I don't want you as the artist to come there, because they know you represent a large constituency. The question is, how do you marshal that constituency to kind of get what you want? And I think that, to me, is the huge issue, and that's our own battle, so to speak.
Sure, anyone else on that topic? Because we could move into how do we get what how do we make it happen? I think, that's a very big question a lot of people have. We talk about the work, but how do we make the work happen, especially when funding for arts and culture, well, let's be honest, was never really there, but it's going away even more and more. So how do you get it done? How do you get community development work done as an arts and culture practitioner? How do you do it now, and how will you do it in the future? What are you worried about? What are your challenges?
So, in terms of the Latin Quarter, I feel like we're just getting started. We just scratched the surface. And we were able to get Arts Place funding, which was wonderful, but that just got us ignited. And we were testing strategies, and now we're sort of in this point in time where the funds are not there, and we're being creative and obviously sort of taking from our general operating and supporting some of the other work. So I think it's an ongoing challenge, and I'm worried about that we had gotten momentum, and now we're in this place where it's like, how do we continue to go deeper and keep delivering on this vision that we now have made public, we have put it out there, we have buy-in from the residents in the neighborhood, and how do we realize that when the funds are limited? We have gone now, we're waiting to hear on federal funding, so we put an application for our town and waiting to see if that happens, and if it does, wonderful, because we'll be able to work on a robust plan for the Latin Quarter over the next 3 to 5 years, which we need to do in order to be able to then go shop around for more funding. And it's critical, but if we don't get those dollars, I'm just not sure how we're gonna get to it. I know we're gonna do it, we're committed to it, but it's gonna take us longer.
What about
So I guess one of the ways that we've gotten it done, and it's interesting to sit next to Celina, because we also have an Our Town grant submitted, and my bet is that but our work has been going on for 30 or 40 years, actually. You know, it started with a town administrator who was a history buff and who really made a deliberate decision from a leadership position to preserve historic buildings and to integrate history and arts and culture into the master plan of the town. And his vision moved us forward to a place where stakeholders like the Mass Cultural Council invested in our town. And so, you know, we were lucky enough to have a dozen years of Adams grants that funded a part-time cultural coordinator for us. And so now our challenge is that now we have to try and figure out how to continue to make that work happen with municipal funding that just really isn't there. But I think I want to kind of loop back around to the previous question and talk about a situation that happened in our town. So I showed you that map and you saw how the river's like on half the border of the town. So to get into our town, you have to go over a bridge, pretty much. So the main bridge to our town was one way for 4 years. So what that meant was that all of these little businesses that had taken a risk on opening up on this kind of desolated main street all started struggling because people could either get in or they could get out. They couldn't do both. But the thing is that this burgeoning kind of like arts can be a driver of economic development thing had started happening in Turner's Falls. And so we had a person whose job it was to look at this challenge and try and turn it into an opportunity. So, for instance, we got mitigation money and we made these signs that we put on Route 2 that had an arrow that told you, hey, there's something over here. Turner's Falls is over here. There's recreation, there's restaurants, there's culture. And then we had this slogan that we made up, Turner's Falls, easy to love, hard to leave. And we also had a fundraiser that was a decorated hard hat auction. So we had 30 artists decorate hard hats, and then we had construction workers and DPW guys model them in our theater. And we advertised like all over the place so that people still knew that Turner's Falls was a place to come and a place where interesting things happened. And those kinds of things, I think, helped to show to our leaders that arts could be a driver of economic development, because that's what helped us get through having the bridge be closed. And that's why I think we have a pretty good chance, actually, of managing to get a cultural coordinator into our budget this year. But you can all keep your fingers crossed.
Well, I think we're out of time. I want to leave you with just the thought also that, you know, arts and culture, it's not enough to just want to be, you know, sitting at the table with other sectors, to understand the other sectors, to look at where they get their money, to get some of that money by speaking their language about what you're already doing, about creating the campaign that brings, you know, money back into a small town and all these other amazing things. You know, that's kind of where we need to start thinking more. And it was a privilege to sit with these folks and to be here with you guys. So please ask more questions and we'll close up for the day. All right?